Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. We haven't had a webinar in a little while, so welcome back. We're thrilled to get them back on track. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to personally pay my respects to their elders past and present. And then I also want to acknowledge on behalf of all of you that AHURI acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout the nation, and that we do pay our respect to elders past and present from all country, and we acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's connections to land, sea and community, and respect their cultural, spiritual and educational practices. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, AHURI, or the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, to say the full name, is a national independent research network. We focus very much on housing and homelessness research, also cities and urban research. And the research is very focused on policy development across all levels of government, every state and territory and the federal government. And also we work with local governments and industry and the community sector to inform housing, homelessness policy and conversation. We have 10 university research partners. You can see their logos there, and we're thrilled to represent researchers from each of those places as well. We've got a chat function on during this webinar, and you can see just, I think it's to the right-hand side of the presentation screen, a chat function which allows you to share your thoughts and observations with other participants. You can also use the Q&A function to post any questions that you may have that arise during the course of the webinar as well. And look, just to break the ice, it might also be a good idea to perhaps suggest what land or country you're joining our webinar from today as a way of getting that chat started. And before we begin the webinar, I do also want to just give a shout out for another event, in fact, our headline event that we've got coming up later in the year, the Australian Homelessness Conference, which is in Darwin this year at the Darwin Convention Centre on the 7th and 8th of October. And we're thrilled to be hosting that event in collaboration with the Northern Territory Government, and encourage you to just jump on that website and have a look and get your registration happening while the early bird is open. Great. Well, today we're going to be talking about this report, which was released very recently through AHURI's National Housing Research Program, which is about public housing transfers, the longer term impacts on investment, tenant experience and sector outcomes. There is a handout available in the handouts section on the right-hand side of the page if you want to have a look at that. But of course, the report and a whole lot of associated material is available on the AHURI website free of charge. So please go there and keep up to date on the research that we're producing. Today we have Edgar Liu here to talk to this research, but I also just wanted to acknowledge the other researchers whose names you had on the screen a moment ago who were part of the production and development of that report. But Edgar's the lead author, and he'll be discussing that work and presenting it today. It was delivered by Edgar's from the University of New South Wales, and researchers from there and RMIT were involved in this particular project. And I'd also like to welcome on screen, you can see Mark Degotardi. Mark is the CEO of Australian Community Housing, which is a national peak body and a not-for-profit body that oversees the work of not-for-profit community housing sector providers. And I will just give a quick, acronym warning ahead of this presentation today. You'll be hearing the letters CHP quite a lot. Those letters stand for Community Housing Provider. So Mark is representing their peak body, but we will be talking a lot about community housing providers over the course of the webinar. Okay, so both Mark and Edgar have very interesting and impressive CVs, and I invite you, I won't be reading them out, but I invite you to have a look at their bios on the AHURI website in the section associated with this webinar. The webinar is going to run for an hour. We're 5 minutes in already, and we'll be wrapping up very sharply at by 1 p.m. Just so you can plan your time. First, I'd like to ask Edgar a few questions about the research and its key findings, and then I'll bring Mark in to, I guess, provide a bit of a response as a key representative from the industry that's being discussed today. And then we'll have, for most of the session, we'll have a bit of a conversation with these people, and we'll be addressing some of the questions that you either put forward live during the webinar, and I know there's also a number of questions that a number of you have supplied ahead of time, which we really appreciate. Thank you for doing that. And I'll be, I guess, raising some of those issues and asking Edgar and Mark to respond to those as we go as well. So Edgar, can I start by just asking you to talk a little bit about what the research was about, what you were trying to achieve, and I guess some of the key things that you did in conducting the research.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, AHURI, for having me today to representing the team to speak about this project. So the project was about the longer-term impacts of what public housing transfer programs have had on the community housing sector. Essentially, we wanted to understand how those kind of transfers impact on the CHP from an operational perspective, from a financial perspective, and from a housing and tenancy outcome perspective. By longer term, we mean the transfer would have taken place for at least 5 years prior to our starting point. And for the purpose of the project, which we started in 2024, we only focused on the transfer programs that took place between 2013 and 2019. So 2013 because the previous AHURI project on public housing transfer finished at around that time. So in terms of the approach to our study, there were 2 stages. The first was an online survey of the 14 community housing providers that actually took part in the large-scale transfers that happened within that time period. And of those 14, 13 participated in that survey. That was followed by 3 in-depth case studies, one from each state of the New South Wales, Victoria, and also South Australia. And we did a range of different qualitative and quantitative approaches, methods. And as you can see on the screen there, we had also wanted to interview frontline staff and also tenants, but resourcing wasn't available. So we had to forego that for this time being anyway.
Yeah, no, thanks, Edgar. And maybe we'll pick up on some of that through our conversation as well. I'm sure we have a lot of people from the sector online, so it'd be interesting to have some of that conversation today. So Edgar, I'm now going to invite you maybe just to talk a little bit about what were some of the key things that you observed, what were some of the main findings of the research, and maybe some of the critical things that stood out for you.
Yeah, so we decided on the case study approach because we wanted to showcase the different models of transfer programs that actually took place in Australia. And you can see on the right-hand side that they are somewhat similar, but they actually took a very different approach in the end on how they actually managed the different transfer programs. You can see in the table the 3 different, actually the 4 different programs across the 3 states that became part of our case study. So the social housing management transfer that took place between 2018 and 2020 here in New South Wales, where I am at the moment. There was also a case of state transfer in Victoria, where it took a much longer timeline to complete. And then the 2 different stages of the Better Places, Stronger Communities program that started in 2015 before a slight adjustment and relaunching as the Renewing Our Streets and Suburbs program in 2017 and 2018. So those were the 3 that were part of our focus in terms of the case studies. So moving on to the findings, by 2024, so towards the end of the first year of our project, around 130,000 properties have been transferred from public housing agencies to the community housing sector. that roughly represents around 1/3 of all social housing holdings in this country. Unlike many other international examples, Australia tends to prefer management transfer, where only the tenancies, the management of the tenancies and the properties are transferred over to the community housing sector rather than the ownership as well. So when we asked the 14 CHPs what they understood to be the primary objectives of these transfer programs were, they primarily responded that it is the injection of investment into property maintenance and repairs into the community housing sector, and also improvements in tenant outcomes as the primary objectives of the transfers. I should note though that the 130,000 is all the properties that have been transferred over to the community housing sector. That includes those that were transferred as part of redevelopment projects. Whereas our project only focused on those that were transferred without redevelopment only.
Yeah, okay. Can I just clarify that 130,000, does that represent you talked about the difference between stock transfer or a management only transfer. Is that number where the actual ownership of the stock was transferred, or does that include the management transfers as well?
That would be both. So it would be primarily management transfer, to a small extent also title transfer.
Thank you.
And across the 13 participants of the survey, most, if I remember correctly, most but not all had actually participated in transfer prior to the current lot of programs that I mentioned in a couple of slides ago. And they were able to make high-level comparisons in terms of how the different programs actually differ. And the general consensus was that earlier transfer programs tend to involve stock that were in comparatively better conditions, that required less maintenance and repair responsibilities. And so they were primarily able to address all of those relatively quickly within a relatively short time frame and without too much financial resourcing. Part of the reason was that the stock in general were just in better conditions, and by the time the current or the last round of transfer happened, only those that were less maintained were still up for grabs, essentially. But a number of CHPs also talked about earlier programs actually involved additional resourcing to help address a lot of the repairing and maintenance requirements, which were absent in the more recent rounds of transfers. And so a combination of those things actually made it a bit more difficult for CHPs, recipient CHPs, to actually carry out that main objective of a lot of the transfers. And so related to that, that has some kind of financial impact on the recipient CHPs. Yes, most of them talked about having an expanded income base through the rental income that they now receive, as well as Commonwealth rent assistance if the transfer tenant actually qualified, were eligible for that level of federal support. But the poorer than anticipated conditions of the properties meant that a lot more resourcing were required to be put into that. A couple of the case studies also mentioned that they had expanded responsibilities that were not accompanied by additional resourcing from the government. So here in New South Wales, for example, our case study mentioned that they were required to take on the temporary accommodation and other housing assistance program, largely because the state government no longer operated within the area of where the transfer took place. And likewise, a lot of other CHPs also mentioned that they have responsibility over whole of community support, whether it is just referral to other services or providing direct support. And all of those things are not necessarily accompanied by additional government resourcing to help out. So, if you're spreading the rental income and CRA over all of those services, is actually quite very thin. So the reflection from the majority of the sector we managed to engage was that the financial impact was quite significant. And by the time of our interview, so at least 5 years after the transfer happened, a small number were actually still feeling the impact of that and continuing to address that challenge.
Mm.
From an operational perspective, most of the CHP talked about participating in transfer program was part of a broader strategy to help grow the sector and as well as their own organization. Partly it is to help them demonstrate to government agencies that they have the capabilities to manage large number of tenancies and properties, which they have been doing for quite a while before any of the transfers happened. But it's just another way for them to demonstrate that capability. It also allow them to grow to a particular scale where they can take on additional opportunities like the Housing Australia Future Fund program that's running right now, where the transfer actually put them in a more advantageous position to take on additional growth opportunities and allow them to grow even further. And like I said, most CHPs actually participated in transfer before, so they were able to learn lessons from those previous transfers and de-risk their operations in the subsequent rounds of transfers that they apply for, and also in other areas of operation. Part of that was in workforce management, because as you saw, a large number of properties were actually transferred over to the sector, and so the workforce needed to expand relatively quickly. Partly because a couple of the case study jurisdictions employed what was known as the one-day switch model, where everything just happened on the same day. Thousands of properties transferred, all the administration, all the documentation happened on the same day. And most HPs had very little lead-in time to prepare for that, particularly when it comes to tenant engagement. That certainly proved to be a challenge in terms of all the day-to-day experiences of tenants and the staff themselves. But the sector also took the opportunity to not just expand by the number of staff that actually work within the providers, but they also changed the way that they operate, both front of house and back of house. There was a lot of professionalization and also a lot more specialization when it comes to specific roles, meaning that for some CHPs at the very least, they were able to offer more catered and tailored support to tenants. They were also more readily able to provide or find detailed insights into their current operations. So at least two of the case studies actually mentioned that they now have a chief information officer, so that they can actually process all the data holdings that they have on hand and work out how best it is to operate their businesses in a more efficient manner. And the other outcome being improvement in tenant services, despite the fact that we didn't actually manage to get to talk to any of the tenants. We did look at the tenant satisfaction survey as a proxy of how that has actually changed. There was a reflection that there was a slight dip in tenant satisfaction level in the initial 1 to 2 years after the transfer happened. And that is, quite likely understandable, because change is scary to anybody, particularly if you're in a vulnerable situation. But for the most part, tenant satisfaction had improved over time to the point where they're generally higher than those reported by those tenants who remain within the public housing system. And it's partly because of the way that CHP was able to offer their support. As you can see on the table on the right-hand side, there was a lot more investment into community development activities, for example, where they were able to offer tenants a lot more support, whether by referral or internally by their own organizations. These changes in outcomes, however, when we talked to several government agencies, was that they were not necessarily always captured within the reportings, which tended to focus on compliance. So, did you spend this much amount on this thing as agreed in the contract? And so there are different ways potentially different ways of recording all of those outcomes rather than just the amount of dollars spent on particular activities. So summing up very quickly, and these are primarily reflections of the sector that we spoke with in terms of how we can actually improve the outcomes of these transfer programs as we look to the future in ensuring of the sector as a whole and also expanding it further. One of the main things that they talked about was the importance of title and ownership to allow them the control they could have over a lot of the stock that they now have responsibility over. One of the things that was discussed was whether there would be flexibility allowed in the contracts and agreements that can allow them to have a bit more control, essentially, over what to do with the stock. One of the examples that was referred to was in the South Australian, across the two programs, where government actually allowed CHP to renegotiate part of the conditions of the transfers and propose redevelopment opportunities. This wasn't reported in our project, but in statistics provided by the state government afterwards was that 89 properties were actually transferred temporarily to the CHP sector for the redevelopment purpose. And the outcome was that 160 new dwellings was able to be delivered and retained by the state government. And then on top of that, another 167 was developed and retained by the different CHPs. So it's more than double the amount of social housing within the system just by making that one little flexible arrangement. And of course, to help pay for all of that, 100 properties were also developed and sold on the market. And so, that number doesn't sound very big, but, it is a way of changing how the current contracting and how the current conditions can be improved through just a little bit of flexibility. Another bit of flexibility is to consider a stage approach. Victoria, of course, was the main proponent of this within the different programs that we looked at, where over several years, the state government actually proactively helped develop the capacity of the CHP taking that on, and started with a management transfer of tenancies before a title transfer much later on. But it doesn't need to be that projected. If you have a large program like the social housing managed transfer, instead of doing thousands of properties all on the same day, you could consider doing different parcels on different day, so that you're not overwhelming the system all at the same time. Flexibility can also include taking on local context. One of the things that was discussed was that a lot of the time, the same rules apply to all CHPs, irrespective of where they were operating. We understood that particularly those who were more specialized or those who are regionally based may have challenges different to other organizations. And so having a bit more flexibility in those kind of conditions will also help. Likewise with the resourcing, especially if the scope extend beyond just the management of the transfer properties and tenancies. And finally, relating back to the previous slide, there should be more focus on the actual outcomes. And one of the ways doing that is to perhaps co-design how those things should be measured within with the community housing sector. They obviously know what they are collecting. They obviously know what they are achieving. So they are probably the best placed to advise the government how those information and how those improvements can be best captured, rather than just by dollar spent on X amount. And I think I would stop there.
Great, thanks, Edgar. I really appreciate that overview of the project and its key findings. And again, I encourage people to go and have a read of the full report at the end of the webinar. Mark, before I hand over to you in just a second to get your take on this, and while you're collecting your thoughts, there was just one question of sort of clarification that came through, and was relating to, I guess, that key finding around the repair and maintenance bill, and some of the response from the sector, a degree of surprise at the additional amount that they had to spend there. Question is in the chat there, which is about who was managing that repair and maintenance program beforehand, and maybe why that presented as such an issue. If you could perhaps just give some clarity around that before I hand over to Mark.
Yeah, I think a lot of the property maintenance was done in-house by governments, but also by subcontracts. So one of the kind of limitations of that was brought up by one of the case study was that as part of the transfer, at least in that case, the maintenance contract was also transferred. So the CHP actually had to take on and finish out the contract that was started by the state government. That meant that, at the very least, they had to maintain two separate services over their entire portfolio that didn't have the operational efficiency that the program actually promised. And so that was one of the things that I think that could have been done a little bit more differently to improve the overall outcomes of the maintenance project process. But also to answer the other part of the question, government agencies often have much larger portfolio, and the oversight can be a little bit more resource intensive. Certainly here in New South Wales, we understand that property condition reports are not done necessarily on an annual basis, at least not for the full portfolio. I think New South Wales does it over 3 years, so a third of all properties are assessed in any year. So at any one point, you would have a report that it might be 1 or 2 years out of date. So how that is actually carried across the entire portfolio with tens of thousands of properties. And that also causes a little bit of problems when it comes to taking on that information and planning out the repairs of the transfer properties.
Great, thanks, Edgar. Mark, interested in your thoughts and response to what you've heard, and also be interested to know, I guess, what you see as the value of this research and how it assists the sector that you represent.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and hi everyone. I guess I'd probably start by saying congratulations to Edgar and his colleagues on the work, and of course from the support of AHURI as well. It's great to see the analysis and research that's been done. So some congratulations to all. We would say in the sector that management transfers have been an important part of our growth and capacity, but it's really clear that that's a growth in terms of our capability, not necessarily a growth in terms of our ability to reinvest or to leverage whatever has come from the management transfers. Edgar's report, or Edgar and his colleagues' report, really points some of this out. By having the scale, we're able to invest in technology, people, systems that actually don't just benefit the tenants that are being transferred, but benefit all the tenants that are within that CHP's work. So, so there are really positive outcomes from that in terms of building capability. And we've seen some pretty good tenant outcomes, although they weren't immediate, and there were absolutely problems with the transfer process, and some of those things are highlighted in the report. I think it's also really important we probably kind of reflect that when most of these transfers were happening, we're in a slightly different world than we are now, and that was a world where there was very little investment in social housing of any kind, whether that's through government, through community housing providers, or other means. So I think the ground has shifted, and I think as that ground has shifted, the relevance of management transfers, but also the maturity of state government housing authorities and the way they engage with also a maturing community housing sector has also changed. And I think that's actually really important. It states the bleeding obvious, but management transfers are not title transfers. So don't do a management transfer expecting the outcomes you'll get from a title transfer. And Edgar gave a really good example of what happens when you provide a title transfer to a CHP. The ability to leverage, redevelop that stock and that portfolio is enhanced. You don't get that from a management transfer. You might get capability improvements and the like. And again, Edgar's report highlights that, but they're not the same things. I guess I would probably end my reflections though saying the CHP sector has absolutely learned stuff from the management transfer, and I'll just kind of highlight perhaps a couple of them. Certainly, and I think it's because we were in a time of where there was no investment in housing, we probably engaged in some of these transfers in a more trusting and less commercial way than perhaps we might if we had our time again. And by that I mean, sometimes we didn't actually get opportunity to understand the portfolio we were getting. But it's absolutely clear that the impacts of the transfers were impacted by the fact that the condition of the portfolios was not the same as the actual, so the reported condition, not the same as the actual condition. Again, the report touches on this, the expense for bringing those properties back up to the reported standard was considerable. Certainly in the New South Wales case, I think the quoted figure was about $92 odd million in backlog repairs and maintenance. Again, context of a time where housing portfolios across the nation were being sold down to fund repairs and maintenance over time. So, we've turned a bit of a corner, I think, in terms of where we are now. Long way to go, but I think it's important to reflect on that. One other thing, two other things I would say. The first is when CHPs have better opportunities around portfolio management, you will get better outcomes over time, and we certainly learnt this. Again, there were some examples in the report. When we're caught in a position of having to continue to repair properties that were beyond useful life or beyond economic useful life, as opposed to being able to take those properties, redevelop them, leverage them and build more and better social housing. Portfolio management must be a key part of the management transfer conversation. The ability to identify properties that are no longer fit for purpose has got to be a critical part of it to get good outcomes. And the last, perhaps the most important observation we would make is that communication with tenants through the process has to be better than it has been. And there's no question that some of those one-day switch examples that Edgar referred to were very challenging for the CHPs, but also extraordinarily challenging for the tenants involved. And I think there was a bit of naivety on both sides, transfer and transferee, of understanding that. And CHPs and I think state government authorities, if they would do these things again, would better understand that a longer term engagement, both between themselves and with the tenants, it's going to deliver much better tenant outcomes than just sort of going from Friday you're with public housing and Monday you're with a community housing provider. That's an impossible situation for both sides. Certainly what we saw is that there was heightened expectations of what would occur, but because there was poor communication, some of those expectations initially were not met, and it took quite a couple of years to return those that growing satisfaction. But we would say finally, I guess, is be really clear about why you're doing a management transfer. This is the other thing I would say that's been a bit opaque. First of all, the contractual arrangements are entirely opaque around this process, and so no one really knows what the outcomes were contracted for, and therefore whether we're successful or otherwise, other than an individual contractor and contractee basis. But be really clear about the policy outcomes you're trying to achieve through the transfer process. And if one of them is growth, well, you're not going to get the growth of the sector. You're not going to get that from a management transfer. But yeah, so we would just like to see some for these things in the future, if they were to come, really much better clarity around what's the purpose of, what's the outcomes you're trying to achieve, what's the policy framework that you're doing this for, and a transparent, open measurement of those outcomes and how successful it's been.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. Appreciate those insights and comments. What we're going to do now is have a bit of a conversation, which is going to be, I guess, structured by what we've heard from some of the participants in the webinar, both through the live Q&A chat, but also, I guess, some feedback and questions we received ahead of time as well, which we're keen to discuss with you. The way I want to structure that is, and picking up your point, Mark, I think, the tenant experience and outcomes are the fundamental thing here and the most important. I want to sort of, I guess, focus on that first and talk a bit about what this means for tenants. And then after that, I'd like to then talk about, I guess, at that sort of organisational level, what it means for providers. And then I also, again, picking up your point, want to talk about what that means for Australia, for our society, and I guess broader policy issues. So kicking off with the tenant conversation, and thanks for raising those issues, Mark, at the end there. But one thing we heard from some of our participants is that there was amongst tenants who were involved in transfers, I guess, a level of uncertainty around their lease conditions, and particularly around two aspects of that. One is I guess the rent. They went from paying rent to public agency to paying rent to a community housing provider. What is the basis of setting the rents? And then also, of course, and this is a critical part of the conversation, community housing providers can access Commonwealth rent assistance as part of their ownership and management of property, and just how that factored in, and where perhaps that led to some uncertainty with tenants around the rent that they were paying, and some concerns that were felt, real or otherwise, about whether their rent was increasing. And then the second thing is around, I guess, security of tenure, and a comment that we received leading up to the webinar around tenants having a perceived sense of their housing having been more secure in public ownership than under CHP management, whether that's real or not. So how were some of what I guess I'm asking both of you, and I'll start with you, Mark, to discuss those issues. What is the truth of the matter there, and also how did some of those concerns factor into transfer programs, if they did, and if not, how can we improve those processes?
Yeah, look, they're all really good questions, and I think the fact that they're being asked really speaks to the fact that, as I spoke to, we had to improve the communication process. Take the New South Wales example, whole portfolios of properties, and therefore whole families and individuals were transferred overnight from one system to another system. Yes, and the CRA adds to the complexity of the rent calculation process. And yes, there's bound to be, for anyone, when you transfer a landlord or you transfer a place, a certain level of anxiety around that. If you don't have the appropriate communication that goes in before that to help meet the tenants, work through those concerns with them, engage with them before you actually do the transfer, it's no surprise that the tenants would raise these concerns and would have these anxieties. So absolutely, there's no question that the failure to engage with the tenants early, and that wasn't a decision of CHPs, but that doesn't matter. This is what we've learned as a system. If we're going to do transfers of tenancies, then a clear and strong and long consultation with the people involved is critical. And so that really has to be improved. I understand why a tenant might go, well, what's going to be different when you move to a CHP? And some of those things you mentioned are different. We are contractually bound to collect rent. We have processes around that, explaining that to tenant, how that's going to work. Again, the CHP didn't get the opportunity to do that. That was a failure of the process and system transfer. Anything that we do from the point on has to deal with that. Clearly there are, for our sector, we are contractually required to collect rent, and where rent's not collected, take action to move on that. Is that different from the public system? Possibly. Should it be? I don't know. That's a question probably for others, but it does speak to the fact that you do want a consistent approach to. There should be no, in my view, there should be no difference between the experience of a public housing tenant and a community housing tenant. No question, but the fact that we don't actually measure those outcomes consistently across both groups means we can't really know that, can we? So, so look, communication beforehand has to be fundamental to any future transfer programs with the tenants, so that they have an opportunity to ask these questions and reduce those anxieties before they move.
Yeah. And Edgar, can I flip to you and also ask, which has come through in the questions just now, around with some of these transfers, particularly around management, was in any case, in any of the case studies that you looked at or that you're aware of elsewhere, was improved tenant participation or empowerment of tenants ever part of that that transfer discussion? And if not, why not? Is it something that was just not thought of at all, or is this are there examples of where I guess greater tenant empowerment, involvement in the process, was part of a transfer process?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. As far as I remember, no, there was just no tenant consultation across the 3 case studies. I don't believe tenant had a choice unless they were completely adamant in staying within the public housing system, in which case then it would require a relocation to a different property. So there was no prior consultation or negotiation or any other terms that has been brought up already in the chat with tenants when it comes to how this transfer should take place, if it is to take place, in what format and what kind of outcomes the tenant would be expecting. So yes, from memory in doing this research and also in doing other related research, was that yes, the communication was required improvement, and it also was very unidirectional from an organization to the tenant rather than the other way or both ways. My memory is that a lot of the regulation required the CHP taking on the transfers to not start communicating with tenants until at least at the most 6 months prior, which is not a very long time to prepare anyone for major changes, right? Like Mark mentioned, changes in how rent is calculated, in the support that you're getting, in the people that you are getting in touch with, and so it is quite a short period of time ahead of a major change in someone's life, essentially.
Yeah. And I mean, you obviously looked at the latter period of the transfer period, but I mean, this has been going on for about a quarter of a century now, as I think we've titled this webinar. But any reflection on why we haven't got any better at doing that? It doesn't sound like that's been a great high point in terms of this transfer process, how tenants have been involved and engaged with, and what's going on there.
I think there have been small steps in improvement. There have been I don't think there have been major market improvements. Just thinking at the 2 South Australian programs, for example, it was intended to be 2 different phases of one program, but they did make small adjustments to the second phase before renaming it as a different program. So there were able to be lessons learned between a relatively short time period, which was 2 years. In terms of the security tenure, for example, the BPSC program was initially on a 3-year trial period with a possible 20-year extension. And a lot of the discussion when I was doing the first round of evaluation was that, tenant, we can't really tell tenant who their landlord would be in 3 years' time because we don't know ourselves. And that created a level of uncertainty that, yes, we are looking after you at the moment, but we also don't know if we will be looking after you in 2.5 years, 3 years' time. And so, the condition was actually changed. The government actually took that feedback on, and so for Roses, which is the second phase, it was a 20-year from the start, and then retrofitted back to the BPSC program, which gave a lot more certainty to tenants in terms of who they would be connecting with, who would be supporting them, and so there are kind of minimal steps in improvements over the years, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Just switching a little bit now to, I guess, discussing some of the organisational implications of the transfer programs that we've reviewed here. Look, Mark, you indicated in your comments that there wasn't necessarily that growth from the process. Can you comment, I guess, in a little more detail around capability and capacity building in the sector? Has this set the sector up, not even if the transfer itself didn't grow an organisation, has the fact that they're now managing more properties or they're owning more properties, has that actually enhanced capability and enabled or set up the conditions for future growth, and particularly now that we have, I guess, a more enabling wider policy context for that?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think the quick answer is yes, and I would probably point that out in two different ways. Perhaps one slightly unexpected, but so the first and the most obvious one is that for organisations that receive the management transfer, and remembering that's not everyone, and certainly in the New South Wales example, a very small number of providers got a very large number of properties, and slightly different in the other two case studies in the report. So, but for those organisations receiving large numbers of transferred properties, yeah, absolutely, the systems investment has been critical. It's been really great the way we've been able to grow and to manage and professionalise the systems internally, to be able to invest in better technology to support those systems and to support our employees who are engaged at the front line with our tenants and residents. And so that's been really fantastic. It's also meant a maturing in terms of size, as you've seen, our ability to attract really good and capable staff. It's also been really useful in terms of the way our boards and governance have evolved, as well as we've been looking after bigger, more complex organisation. That's built all of those skills in one part, at least one part of the sector. That's not true across the whole sector. So,
were there minimum requirements asked of providers before the transfer took place? Like, we've been talking a bit about how the transfer itself has helped grow those capabilities. Was there, did providers have to demonstrate capability prior to transfer? Was that part of the deal?
Yeah, and in my understanding, the answer is yes to that. They bid for certain portfolios of properties in certain locations, and there was a due diligence process as part of that. Exactly what was in that and exactly what's in the contract is all commercial in confidence, so it's not publicly known. I think actually, as I mentioned earlier, the outcomes piece is an important thing we should think about with this work. The second thing, though, I would say, though, is where transfers have also been important, is it's reset the relationship between housing authorities and CHPs, at least in some jurisdictions. I think a healthy system has multi-providers, both of whom are held accountable for the way they deliver services and for the tenant outcomes for the people that live in their homes. That should be the same. That's my personal view. One of the things that having the CHPs as a larger part of the sector within a particular jurisdiction is that the conversation and engagement between the State Housing Authority and the CHP sector changes. So it's less of a master-servant kind of relationship, more of a provider-provider relationship. Sure, there's commissioning, engagement, contracting, but it's changed the nature of that, and I think that's a positive thing. I think it's a positive thing, not just for the CHP sector, but I think it's a positive thing for tenancy outcomes and for the residents who are in social housing generally. So, and I think we're starting to see some of those outcomes in New South Wales, for example. Homes New South Wales recently committed to a minimum tenant satisfaction outcomes, which is a good and an aspirational commitment that hasn't been seen before. I'd like to see that more across both of our systems equally, and the measurement of those outcomes more transparent, and all of us accountable for that.
And Edgar, on the other side of the ledger, the other organisations involved here are, state and territory agencies and departments. What was their interest, I guess, in facilitating these transfers, either property and or management, and what, I guess, did they expect to get out of it relative to what they've got out of it? Was there anything that came through the research that can speak to that?
Yeah, like I showed in one of the early slides, the sector understood that the improvements in property management and tenancy outcomes was part of the main objectives of doing it. And I think that's what the government's actually expected, based on the data that was available to them and to the sector. There generally is higher level of satisfaction. There's generally is higher level of support received by tenants that live within the community housing sector, whether it is through direct provision of the CHP themselves or through partnerships that are not necessarily available to government agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in that sense, that was what they had expected. And I think to a large extent that had been achieved. Don't believe any of the three case studies at the very least had expected significant growth as a direct outcome of the transfer. But, like Mark had said, there are a lot more other opportunities that came at the same time or before and after as well that allow the sector to grow even further. And so, capability of the sector is the main objective, whether it is through the number of people who work in there, whether it's the number of tenants who are actually supported through the system, whether it is the way that the services are being offered. I mentioned specialization and professionalization. So all of that actually transferred the sector to a different way as well, I think.
Mm. Can I ask then about, I guess, specific subsectors within that as well? And we've had a few questions come through, particularly around the Aboriginal housing sector, Aboriginal community housing sector, and how they have benefited or been involved in this process. One of your case studies was Victoria. There was a very large transfer of property in one instance there in relation to the Aboriginal housing sector. Can you make some comment, I guess, around that, and if that was, if you heard anything through the survey and the research process that was specific to that sector?
Yeah, it's obviously a little bit different to a lot of other organizations. There was a lot more specializations in terms of the services and the tenant cohort that they looked after as well. The transfer model was also very different. It was the protracted stage transfer where the state government, it wasn't an open bidding process. The state government actually targeted the CHP to say, we want to support you in this way. So we want to start a long-term process in how we can actually support your growth and how you can actually support the benefit and the well-being of your tenants. And so it actually went through the management transfer early on with a lot of government support from the state government, from the registrar, in helping the sector growth to a certain extent before the title transfer actually took place. Having said that, the report that we had from speaking with them was that despite knowing the tenancies and the properties the tenants had lived in for probably 10 years, there was still a lot unknown in terms of property maintenance requirements when they took on the title transfer. And so that still set them back a little bit than they had anticipated. In terms of the Aboriginal specific services, yes, there was a lot more support from a state government perspective because there was this, I guess, ethos for self-determination compared to other more mainstream providers, I suppose. And so there was a lot more resourcing put into supporting growth in that capacity, in terms of centre services, to help that organisation deliver what is required to support the tenants appropriately.
Look, thank you. And look, perhaps Mark, building on that a little bit, in terms of location of properties for transfer too, was there some sort of differential, across, say, metropolitan versus more regional? And I'm picking this up because we did have, particular interest from some of the attendees at the webinar on, I guess, more remote housing as well, and how, I guess, that plays into this process.
So certainly in some of the transfer experiences to date, we've seen whole of location transfers in both regional area, metros and regional areas. Less so in my experience around remote locations. And I think certainly when you're talking about First Nations housing, we would certainly advocate for ownership and management of that housing by appropriate Aboriginal organisations, not just a management transfer. But we've certainly seen the regional transfers work pretty well, actually, particularly where that's been whole of location transfer, where the CHP involved picks up the responsibility for a range of services and understands on the ground perhaps better than the state government authority what's happening through that process. So we've seen some really good outcomes. I would note, I have seen a couple of questions coming through the chat. I just would note that we actually do have tenant satisfaction data. CHPs are required to conduct that survey through a regulatory regime and to meet regulatory standards. So there is a could it be improved? Yes, absolutely. Should there be consistent reporting of tenant outcomes across public housing and social housing? In my view, yes, absolutely. So the room to move, but there is actually a system in place.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Look, we are getting towards the end of our time, and I did want to, I guess, turn to a broader sort of system-wide perspective as well. So I might just put that out there in terms of a question around, I suppose, the future. And we've seen around 25 years of differentially paced transfer programs in different states and territories in Australia. We've picked up, I guess, a policy idea that was, I guess, developed and acted on first in other places, particularly the UK. What is the future of this? Have we reached sort of, maximum transfer capacity? Are we looking at having more transfers? Is there a structural limit on how we do that? And I guess, what does this mean broadly for our system in terms of the interrelationship between public providers and community housing providers? If you can both just quickly reflect on that sort of question before we wrap up, that would be great. And I'll go to you first quickly, Mark. Thanks.
So look, I think where we are in the current system, that probably management transfers are less of a priority at this stage. Certainly we would say, if we're going to be doing transfers of property and you want to invest in the growth of the system, title transfers are a preferred system. But whether it's title transfer or management transfer, learn the lessons of engagement and communication and clarity of outcomes for why you're undertaking one methodology or another. But certainly would probably say management transfers are less of a profile at the moment than they might have been a little while ago.
Great, thank you. And obviously some lessons to be learned in how that's done going ahead as well. Edgar, some thoughts from you in closing as well.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Mark. Speaking with all of the case studies and the other CHPs, there is, at least amongst the small number that we spoke with, there is a view that the sector can operate a lot more independently of government, with, or at the very least, less direct government support to a certain extent. But at the same time, we also need to bear in mind that the CHPs that have been able to take on transfers, because of their capability requirements, tend to be much larger than the average size. And so a lot of the smaller organizations, a lot of the more specialized organizations have not had a similar opportunity to receive this kind of support. So whether, if transfers come back on the table at some stage, whether they need to look at it very differently, rather than just helping the large organizations grow larger, then that probably needs to be taken into account on how that should be done differently. Great,
thanks, Edgar. I think that's some really good thoughts for us to finish on, but we've got to the end of our time. That's happened very quickly. But look, thank you both of you for your thoughts and your input today. We've really appreciated that. And just a few quick things before I close this down. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Can you please complete the survey that you will receive following the webinar? We'll also send you for those of you who've registered, an email to let you know once the recording from the webinar is available on our website, and it will be up there in the future for you to come back to or to share with others should you be interested in doing that. And if you're interested in hearing about future webinars, do keep an eye out in the AHURI news in your inbox. Finally, just thank you for joining us. I hope we'll get to see you again soon at future webinars, and maybe in person at our homelessness conference in Darwin. Thank you very much. See you later.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mark.